Hello, Dr. Dorothy. How are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Okay,
How's it
welcome.
going?
It's going, busy day, trying to get
Yes,
prepared for this.
yeah, it's been pretty busy for me also.
How are you? My name is Alexandra Odom. I am one of the producers, a part of the team, and I'm also worked as a historian as a part of this documentary. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. I first want to thank the NAACP Youth Council for sponsoring this viewing today, and then I also want to thank Miles Charles for introduction to our film today. We really appreciate you all working with us to kind of talk about the documentary and some of the really important issues that we're going to be discussing today. Thank you so much for the panelists who will be joining us. I will be giving brief introductions in a moment, but in just a moment, we will have a link to the program posted into the chat. The program has all of the panelists that will be here today, some of our other contributors, and all of the cast members. So if you want to take a look and if you wanted to read a little bit more about everyone who you just saw speak in the documentary, go ahead and click that link, and all of the bios are posted there. So I first want to take the time to introduce all of our panelists so that you all kind of know who you'll be hearing from over the next hour during our conversation. So I want to start with Dr. William Darity, Sandy Darity for short. Some of you all might know him as Sandy, who is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies, and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. Thank you so much, Dr. Darity, for joining us. I also want to introduce you all to Danita Mason Hogan. She is a native of Chapel Hill for 7 generations on both sides of her family, and she is a curriculum specialist and has been an education activist for over 30 years. You heard from both Sandy and Danita in the film. I also want to introduce you to Dr. Benjamin Blaisdell. He is an assistant professor in the College of Education at East Carolina University, where he teaches courses on diversity and equity in education. Thank you so much for joining us. And then last but not least, of course, is Ms. Laura Kale. She is the director of KidScope, with specialized staff providing social, emotional health services for young children, consultation in childcare classrooms, parent education, inclusive childcare, and resources for families and providers of young children. So thank you all so much for joining us. I am really excited to get this conversation started. So thank you so much to all of our attendees for joining. And I kind of wanted to start us off with a question. So we've watched the documentary. All of our attendees have kind of gotten an idea or begun to learn about what is going on in the Chapel Hill public school system, gotten a peek into the history, but I wanted to kind of start there with the history, right? So we have come a long way in the past 40, 50 years or so. So I wanted to ask you all, how far have we come, but what can we learn from some of these historical missteps? Of course, not all of the things that have happened over the past 40 years are positive, and there have been many initiatives to kind of shift our school system and change the way that it is, but not all of them have been successful. So one of the things I would like you all to respond to is, how far have we come, and what have we learned from that history, and what have we learned from some of our historical missteps?
Well, I can start. As we know, in slavery, legal enslavement ended in 1865. And in 1866, the Quakers started a school in Chapel Hill. So for 100 years, until the school systems were integrated in 1966, Black and white students had a separate and very unequal education. Oftentimes, white schools outspent Black schools at about 8-1. So when the school systems were integrated in 1966, and I would add that that is about 12 years after Brown v. Board, and Chapel Hill reluctantly integrated the school systems, they were not prepared for the Black students who were entered into their school system. And as a consequence, the Black school systems lost 75% of its administrators, their school leaders, and their teachers. So this came to a head. I was reading an article maybe a few weeks ago in 1970, and there was this big kerfluffle in the Chapel Hill-Carrboro City Schools in 1970 in November, and the community was meeting to talk about what to do about these newly integrated students that they were not prepared for. So they identified 4 areas of concern. One was that the teachers did not look like the students. So the students did not have teachers that looked like them. They were very concerned about school discipline. They were also talking about the lack of cultural awareness that the teachers had. And of course, we had the achievement gap during that time. And this was in 1970. So the Public School Forum of North Carolina had a committee on racial equity. And so here we are in 2020, and they identified 7 domains of concern for students. And one was school discipline, one was lack of teachers who looked like them, one was a lack of a cultural understanding, one was a lack of opportunity gap, overrepresentation in special education courses, and underrepresentation in academically gifted or academically advanced programs. And also finally, the 7th domain was the resegregation of schools. So Alex, I would say that we have not come far enough. We are still struggling with the same issues that we had 50 years ago. So if history is a judge, it has not borne us into a better place academically for Black students and Latinx students, but specifically for Black students who have been suffering generations of undereducation in the school system.
Thank you so much. And so for our other panelists, I'll just go ahead and restate the question. So we're talking kind of about how far we've come or how far we haven't come, as Ms. Mason-Hogan's so articulately pointed out to us. But what did we learn from some of these historical missteps? She really did a great job of showing us how our current moment really does reflect where we were 50 years ago. So what has happened in this past 50 years, and why haven't we come further?
So I think Danita Mason-Hogan's observation suggests that we haven't learned much of anything, or to the extent that we've learned it, we've ignored it. My personal connection to the Chapel Hill schools actually goes back closer to 60 years now. In 1961, I was actually a student at Glenwood Elementary, and I was one of 2 Black students at Glenwood Elementary. And that was because the 2 of us had parents who were graduate students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And at that time, graduate student families lived in what was then known as Victory Village, but is now known, like your last name, as Odom Village. And the students whose families lived in Victory Village were all channeled to Glenwood Elementary. They were all bused to Glenwood Elementary. And so there was a complicated question of whether or not they were going to bus the 2 Black students who were living in Odom Village, or what was then Victory Village, to an all-Black school in town. And ultimately, for whatever reason, it's not clear to me, they chose not to do that. And so the 2 of us actually, in quotes, desegregated Glenwood Elementary. But I think what's more significant is that although full school desegregation took place in 1966, partial school desegregation was taking place at different levels of schooling prior to that. And in 1964-65, Guy B. Phillips Middle School, or what was then Guy B. Phillips Junior High School, was actually desegregated en masse. And I was actually part of that group. I was a 7th grader at the time. And what was very apparent to me, and this is in 1964 and 1965, the Black students were disproportionately located in the classes that people did not identify as the most challenging classes. So there were pods of students who traveled in different tiers of the curriculum and instruction at the school. And I would like to suggest that there's been absolutely no significant change in that set of circumstances. And that's closer to 60 years.
Yeah, and I'll add, I mean, so my work is studying, I do ethnographic work in schools. So I'm spending a lot of time in schools to see what happens and what teachers are doing. And it's a race-focused work. And I think that's exactly right, that there's been change, but not progress, right? And so when you have attempts to integrate, although sometimes they're attempts to desegregate but not fully integrate, is you also, that's not the only thing that's changing. White supremacy is changing too, right? White supremacy is going to adapt to its new situation, and our country is founded and entrenched in white supremacy, and so therefore, of course, our school systems are too. And so all of our attempts to do racial equity work in schools will eventually, there will be attempts by white supremacy to take that over and to shift power back to some and take it away from others. And I think what we sometimes can do is try to find out where that's happening and intervene, but it's often we don't do very well in education. And education is how to predict what the next mutation of white supremacy will be.
From an early childhood perspective, because that's my lens, looking at it, seeing how childcare centers are often segregated, they're often based on the neighborhood, and thinking about how we can pull them together through the years. It was back, I believe, in the 1960s when developmental day centers became a thing here in North Carolina, and that focuses on inclusion. It brings the children who have the disabilities into the center to really incorporate that. I think that looking at that model can help us to move forward. But again, as the other panelists have said, we're not there. We haven't done it. We have so much work to do to get there.
Thank you so much, Ms. Carroll. And so my next question is, what is the work then that we need to do to get there? What are some of the tangible next steps that need to be taken within the school system? But then also, as we kind of discuss that, what does a community that supports these kinds of changes look like? What does a community that supports the kind of school system that we would like to see look like?
Well, I do think I would be remiss if I didn't weigh in on the fact that not a lot of these positions for school board members are voted upon. And I do think that organizing the vote is something that's very important and critical. I also think that as we look at ways of dismantling white supremacy and white supremacist structures, we really have to look at ways to engage and build up new structures that are more collaborative and also are really rooted in solution building. And it's going to take a lot of work. I think it'll take work from the community, but I think the first step is to realize that despite the oppression that has really inundated our community, there is a lot of power that we could collectively have. And I also think that we have to be bold in this moment. I don't see a lot of boldness in terms of being explicit. I mean, this situation that we find ourselves in took hundreds of years literally to cultivate. And I think we need to be explicit when we talk about solutions to this particular problem. And no one really wants to address the historical context and the historical nature. And I think Black people in Chapel Hill have a specific relationship with the Chapel Hill-Carrboro City Schools and frankly with the University of North Carolina. And I think there's a specific remedy that needs to be applied to this particular problem. Instead of using nice and kind words, I think we need to use forceful action to remedy some of these problems and being very deliberate and very explicit in terms of what we are trying to accomplish.
I think that one of the factors to take into consideration is the condition that we frequently ignore, which is the way in which white supremacy emanates in school systems, particularly in communities where there are major colleges and universities that have a significant influence on the policies that the school systems pursue. We normally don't think of racism as emanating from the intellectual community or the most highly educated members of the community. But the reason why we have these types of practices in the Chapel Hill and Hill-Carrboro school system is primarily because of the preferences of highly educated white parents who want to preserve or engage in acts of opportunity hoarding. They want to preserve opportunities for their own children to the exclusion of others. And as a consequence, there is no significant effort to provide high quality curriculum and instruction to all students in the system. And I would add that I think that the film provides a powerful analysis and description of the way things are. But I think the missing piece perhaps is why things are the way they are that way, and the political dimension of the process of creating school policy is something that we need to really address head on.
Yeah, and I see this happen on so many levels. So there's white parents like myself who, we think we're well-intentioned, want the best things for our kids, for our own kids who are in the school system. And that sometimes, but we can't, sometimes we have a really hard time envisioning that can't come at the cost of other students, right? And we push, so we talk about the video, the documentary talks about it in terms of gifted ed. And that's just one of the many places in schools where that happens, that there are gifted ed, it looks the way it looks because it works for some kids. It gives resources to some kids who get labeled as gifted. But this happens even when you get away from gifted ed. You can get into even integrated classrooms. And the way parents push teachers to get their kids special things, white parents, I should say, get their kids special things, means that teachers are under pressures to do that. But even the normal way teachers, even well-intentioned teachers that I get to work with in the district, view the worthiness of a child in the classroom is race-based, right? And so I can give you an example. So we'll have even integrated group work. So you have a Black kids, sometimes with Latinx kids, white kids, all together in a group. And what will happen is a white student has learned that they have more voice because the teacher will listen to them a bit more and say, why do I have to wait? I'm waiting for that kid while you're helping that kid. What am I supposed to do now? And it shifts the teacher's attention back to the white child. And schools and teachers don't even, again, these are well-intentioned teachers, think they have to give the attention back to that white child, perhaps because they have a higher test score, or they have a higher grade, or they have a higher reading ability as demarcated by a reductive standardized test, right? And so what happens is you have attention going to some kids and away from other kids, and therefore resources, right? Learning and curriculum going towards some kids and not to other kids. And that becomes normalized as early, in my view, when I've seen it, as early as kindergarten, and I'm sure it happened before. And so both, in the case of where I'm working, Black and brown kids are learning that they don't have as much of a voice and that they have to be the ones to wait for while the white kids are learning. And the white kids are learning the same thing. They're learning that they don't have to wait and that Black and brown kids should. And we're fostering a culture where that repeats itself from grade level to grade level. And so there's got to be a real intervention at so many levels when we're talking about intervening and how we view worthiness of the students in our classrooms.
Sadly, it happens even before kindergarten. It's happening at the earliest of ages. One of the things that Dr. Darity was saying is look from the educated, the white professors, the well-meaning, as you said, Dr. Blaisdell, professors, the ones who write the evaluations, the tests that are looking at quality ratings for our childcare centers. They have so much implicit bias within them that if well-intentioned teachers and childcare providers aren't taking that step back to really look and see how are these implicit biases even playing themselves out in early childhood with our infants, our toddlers, our preschoolers. By the time they make it to kindergarten, so many of these children have these beliefs within them that they don't realize necessarily. They're coming to school, they're coming to kindergarten and elementary school already prepared for all of these racist happenings. And they didn't even know because our society has programmed it.
And so what is the solution to that, right? So what do you say to a parent who is listening to this conversation who says, oh, wow, it seems like a lot of these notions are kind of coming up before the kids even hit the school system and they just get reinforced by the school system? Or even, Dr. Darity, you mentioned these opportunity hoarding, right? When white elite parents come and they really do want their kids to have access. So what do you say to parents or to a broader community? How can those attitudes outside of the school support some of the shifts that need to happen within it?
Well, okay, I guess this is to me. I think ultimately what happens to kids in terms of processes of academic achievement is attributable to what happens within schools. I think that we have a lot of evidence now that that things that people invoke as factors that inhibit student performance, like family background or neighborhood characteristics, truly can be overcome with quality teaching and instruction within the school. But the teachers have to be prepared to do that, and they have to have an expectation that the students are capable. And I think that's critical. But what needs to happen outside of the schools, I think, has to do with the political process that influences what school policies are. And I guess I'm somewhat reluctant to talk about well-meaning or well-intentioned people in the context of a set of actions that have taken place over the course of upwards of 60 years since school desegregation first took place. And so I think that, you know, we have to be straightforward in recognizing that these kinds of practices and policies that parents engage in, white parents, external to the school system, but that directs what happens within the classroom settings, are things that have to be confronted as morally corrupt and unjust.
I would agree with Dr. Darity. I would also say that I believe that until we get serious about educating Black students, I cannot imagine a scenario where 70% of white students were not meeting end of course proficiency or not prepared to go to school. I cannot imagine a scenario where that would not be a crisis and an emergency and would be put at the forefront in terms of what needs to be done at school. So I think that the school homepage for the Chapel Hill-Carrboro City Schools should say 70% of our Black students do not make end of course proficiency. And we have the second largest achievement gap in the country. And I think every teacher should begin their day like that. I believe it should be on the morning announcements every day, because if a person's house was on fire, I think we need to be talking about it. And I think it goes with what Dr. Ben was talking about in terms of how we value our students. And I think it's very, very clear that we are complacent and we're comfortable with 70% of our students not meeting proficiency. And I think that is a shame. And I think that we should be shouting to the rooftops until we get serious about doing something about it.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And so where my expertise is not how do we change communities, how do we change and that level, but how do we change schools and what teachers do? That's where I do my work. And I think the big issue, or at least one of the big issues we're talking about, is racism and white supremacy. And so a school has to change its purpose. If that's what schools are now, is that they are white supremacist. They have to go in with that acknowledgement and be purposefully anti-racist. That has to be part of their mission. And not like as one of the 8 things we do, but that has to be the driving force of what the school does, is that we are about speaking to power, right? And so I think that's a pretty radical shift for what schools would have to do, right? And so what teachers can do, what principals can do is can you get enough teachers or principals or people in one place to be like-minded enough to say, that is what we are going to do. That is going to be our school identity. And I'll give a shout out to Northside Elementary, right? I work with Northside Elementary, right? they have 4 belief statements. The first belief statement is that we believe that white supremacy is a part of schooling and we are committed to acting against it, right? That's their first belief statement, right? And then they go from there, right, to talk about how, right? And to talk about the kind of conversations we'll have. And I don't want to paint it as a utopia or as something of where we've cured racism, because that's certainly not the case. But the word I like to use is we've developed an insurgency into racism, right? We are purposely trying to build an identity that is about that. And now let's talk about curriculum. Now let's talk about discipline. Now let's talk about these other things. And I think it takes those kinds of radical shifts in purpose rather than tweaking method or tweaking a little bit of curriculum here, a little bit of curriculum there. I think it has to be something that radical if you want to actually see some kind of shifts in what schools do.
I would also like to note that Coretta Sharpless is a product of Chapel Hill-Carrboro City Schools and is herself a generational Chapel Hillian. So I think that she has a special understanding about the school system and the implications on Black children. And I think that's really important because when we look at the advisory committees to change, to change some of these policies, we need to have generational Black people on those committees and those commissions so we can gain a better understanding of what needs to be fixed. I also would like to send a shout out to the always brilliant Kirsten Mullen and Sandy Darity for their book, From Here to Equality, because it gives a really nice historical perspective in terms of education and what has happened in North Carolina. And I think it is really an essential read for us to understand that this just did not happen in 2020, that this was very calculated, was part of a narrative, and it was part of policies that were put in place for 100 years or more.
And it will take stepping into discomfort. It will take the white people who are in power to step into their discomfort, to the white teachers to step into that discomfort. And as you said, have that statement plastered on the homepage, put it on the sides of buses, put it everywhere so that people recognize this and they're able to see it and talk about it. Not only see it pass by and ignore it, but talk about it and recognize it and live in the discomfort so that we can make that change happen. But this is going to take time. This has been building for so many years. There's no quick fix.
And I want to kind of talk about that discomfort for a little bit. So I feel like when people hear the terms white supremacy or racism, they kind of balk at it, right? And they see these as like, oh, well, if I'm not violently racist or like I'm not violently a white supremacist, then surely that doesn't apply to me, right? And so let's kind of make it clear, because I kind of want to be sure that we kind of tease this out. What does white supremacy and racism look like in our schools, right? And how can we dispel the notion that it is always some aggressive, violent act, but that it really is kind of embedded into our system? So can you all kind of speak to what does it look like and how are we seeing it?
Well, I would just like to say quickly, because I think other folks can really speak well to what it might look like in the classroom. What I can say for sure is that poverty is inherited in Orange County. Orange County has the largest wealth gap in the state of North Carolina. Poverty is inherited and privilege is also inherited. So there are some children that are born into poverty. There are some children who are born into privilege, and the way in which we receive an education and the way that we're viewed and valued is very much rooted in that. So I would say that if you are white and you were born in Orange County, or even you came to Orange County, you inherited a particular privilege. If you were Black and came to Orange County, you inherited a particular perception or a particular place in Orange County.
Well, I guess I'd like to comment on what the world would look like if we were doing things differently. And I think we have a precedent that we could really benefit from examining closely, which is a program that is known as Project Bright Idea. Now, there's something else that's called Project Bright Idea in North Carolina, but what I'm thinking of is a program that was introduced into some of the schools in the poorest districts in the state in the beginning of well, I guess towards the latter half of the first decade of the 21st century. It was funded by the Javits Foundation, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education. And it was a program that provided an opportunity for teachers to be retrained so that they could provide gifted quality education for all of the students in their classes. And I think that one of the effects of this was to significantly alter the numbers of students, particularly from underrepresented groups who were identified as gifted and talented. It also resulted in a substantial improvement in the performance of students on the standardized tests that the state customarily provides. And it did not result in a deterioration in the performance of students who were from families that were more privileged. It just meant that everybody else caught up more. And in fact, the kids who were from the communities that had been deprived of quality education caught up more. They gained more in the process. And so I would recommend looking at the experiences that schools have had with Project Bright Idea as a basis for trying to reimagine how you would do things in classrooms across the state as well as in Chapel Hill.
Yeah, and so I'll try to connect two things. So back to your question about white supremacy looks like. So the example I gave before of, even within a small group of students, funneling attention one way rather than another way is white supremacy. I mean, right? And when I think of the example I'm thinking of, it was a kindergarten teacher I got to work with who was a Black woman. And again, she was very reflective and was able to catch it and able to call it herself white supremacy and then shift her teaching not to do that. But right, it shows how this is systemic, right? That what we call the grammar of schooling, or the way we think of doing schooling is, oh, somebody shows that they can do a certain skill, right? Regardless of where they've come from and what got them there before, they can do a certain skill, although we haven't looked at other skills, we've only looked at certain skills, and we say they're therefore more worthy. And then because they are more worthy, we give them more chance to do more things, right? And we invest more property into them. And we know that that falls along racial lines because as we've heard, that poverty has been inherited, right? And so people are dealing with a lot, and poverty isn't because there's anything wrong with people. Poverty is because there's ongoing, still both de facto and de jure racial segregation happening in our communities, right? So communities are put upon in racism outside the school. They come into the school, and as I talked about before, then it's perpetuated in that way, and who we deem worthy. And then to Dr. Darity's point, there are models out there that we can look for where people start to imagine school very differently. Like, what if we imagined all students are gifted, and gifted was what all students get, right? Which is, I think we have to really get away from a notion of gifted is what we have. And the school I'm working with is using the work of Dr. Goldie Muhammad, right, in Cultivating Genius, which is looking at Black literary societies from, I think it's the 1900s, if I'm getting the history right, that look at education and skills as just one of the 4 things that they do. Identity development and all these other things are much more important. And so we can capture people's genius and worthiness in much more complete ways than we do. And we have to have a racial lens in doing that, because we know society is going to try to shift away from doing that and try to find worthiness in whiteness. So we have to do both those things.
To answer the question of what does white supremacy look like in a classroom, it looks like the Black and brown boys being suspended and expelled at higher rates. It looks like the Black and brown girls being called sassy and told to be quiet and sit still. That's what it looks like. And we can change it. There are ways to change it. It is possible. But first, again, we have to step into that discomfort and recognize that that's what's happening.
Thank you all for that. And so I want to call attention to one of our attendees, Vitaya, who has featured in the film, and she really had a lot of great things to say. So Vitaya, if I can bring you into the conversation, let me go ahead and see if I can. Vitaya, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes. um
And so, Vitaya, let me go ahead and give you a proper introduction, just like I did the other panelists. So Vitaya, born and raised in Chapel Hill, she has attended the Chapel Hill-Carrboro City Schools since she was in pre-K. She enjoys listening to music in the rain, and she is currently 14 years old. So Vitaya, what do you have as a response to some of the things that we've been talking about?
being in class now, I can see like this is an eye-opener. I can put a name to what's actually happening around me that I see. For example, we had these things at school. They're called hall passes, and you need one to go to the hall. Well, me and the other Black girls, we would go, and we actually have the hall passes, but we would be followed around the hallways by like a group full of like maybe three teachers. They would just randomly follow us around the hallway, make sure we're going to where we're going. And it's like, well, you don't do that to any other kids. Why do you do it to us? And it's not like we were raising trouble or doing anything normal kids don't do. So for a while, until there was a name put on it, it was hard to understand why, and to kind of like, you don't know what to do in a situation where you feel like you're being treated different than other students in the classroom with teachers that you're supposed to trust.
Thank you so much. Oh, and that's one of the things that we've been talking about, and that's one of the things that Dr. Rhonda Bullock really pointed out, right? That kids are recognizing these things in school. And like Matai was saying, even if they don't know how to name these things, and even if they don't really know how to respond to it or how to call people out to it, and really even if they feel like they don't have the authority to do so, they're seeing these things happen, right? So like these ideas of white supremacy and these ideas of racism are taking place on a day-to-day basis. And so I'm going to go ahead and ask some of the questions that have been asked in Q&A for all of our attendees. If you have a question that you would like to ask to our panelists or to Vitaya, somebody else who has been featured in the film, by all means, go ahead and submit it there. But I kind of want to think about what Ms. Diane Jackson has asked us. So what steps should the Black and Brown community take to hold the district accountable, right? I think that once you identify that all of these things are happening, once you start to talk about white supremacy and racism in the schools, once you start to talk about 70% of Black children not meeting their end of grade benchmarks, right? How do we hold the district accountable to actually address these things? Because these are things that have been known for a while now, but they still have yet to be addressed. There is not that sense of urgency, like Ms. Mason Hogan's has said. There is not that sense of urgency. It is not viewed as a crisis. So how do these communities hold the district accountable? And what can white parents also do to help them in that process?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that Diane Jackson is one of Chapel Hill's gems and jewels. And I would like to thank her so much for all of her advocacy, because she's been advocating for Black and Brown and children in the district for at least 30 years. And she set the example. I say this because she has set the example of what it means to advocate for children. So people like her, Lori Clark, Bonita Joyce, Courtney McLaughlin, these are ladies who have not only tried to hold the district accountable, but also have offered alternative solutions in terms of education. Anna Richards, there are a lot of Black women that I would like to point out, not just going to the school system and talking about what needs to happen in the community, but actually being a part of that solution. So I would say that, yes, we need to hold the school system accountable. Yes, we need to make sure we vote and understand what our role is in policy making and policy decisions and inform the community. But we also need to be super duper advocates like Ms. Jackson.
I feel as if there should be more people that quote unquote have power speaking up about it. I think they don't tend to because their kids are the ones that are getting the special treatment and the advanced learning. But I feel as if they help and we all come together, we can fix or at least better the situation we're in now.
You asked about what can white parents do and white people do. Yeah, and I think Ty put that well, right? And I wanted to speak back to her experience, right? So being followed around, even though she was legitimately being where she was, that happens so often in the schools where I've worked. And then I'll just throw out another term that our schools are so often a site of anti-Blackness, and where white folks in particular view Blackness as always a potential threat, as always a potential negative, as always something out of place. And therefore we want to control it to keep things and what we in our mind have mistakenly viewed as pure. And there's a culture that happens both in schools and in our society. I mean, that's why white people police Black folk in cafes, at parks, right? Taking out their garbage, whatever it is. We see those same things, those news stories we see are the same things we see in schools. And I think the Taya's example speaks to that. So in part what white folks can do, in addition to those who have power, to join with folks of color who have power and listen to their stories and listen to their leadership, is I think, we as white folk, like, we really need to have a reckoning with our own anti-Blackness. It is so often deep-seated within us, and there's individual good white folks, and I hope some of us try to be, but we as a people so often hold Blackness in such contempt that we need to control it. And until white folks either come to a reckoning with that, I think those of us who are trying to do the work have to make it uncomfortable, have to make our anti-Black actions have consequences and speak out to it in those ways. Because it's until we get past that, I don't know how white people actually shift.
I think that's a good point. Calling people out, being willing to call people out when we do see anti-Blackness, racist actions, racist speech. If we see someone following Vitaya in the hallway when she has a hall pass and she belongs there, call them out. Say, why are you doing this? It's stepping into that discomfort. It's that reckoning, like you're saying. It's self-awareness, our own work that has to happen because it starts with us.
It's also difficult for students to stand up for themselves without getting in trouble. Lots of times when students are sent out of class, it's simply for like speaking up on their own behalf or saying, hey, I don't think this is right what you just did. And it's being looked at as disrespect instead of you respect me, I respect you.
Great, and so I want to go ahead and pivot a little bit and shift to Dawn, one of the other producers on the film. So Dawn has a question that she would like to ask, and so I just want to go ahead and invite her into the conversation so that she can do that.
Okay, thank you. Although I do see some great questions in there coming from the panel, but I do want you all to speak to just how savage white backlash can be in the presence of Black achievement, and how when we see Black scores rise, we see because I've experienced this, you know, it is like the world tilted, or I mean, it is, you know, when I think of, you know, what we know about whether Black Wall Streets or whether it's Wilmington or, you know, Durham blowing a highway through the community, you know, there is, I think folks who were, I want you to address folks like, you need to be ready because this is a real wall you're going to hit. You need to be, so I want you guys, you're the professionals.
Yes, thank you. So how do we address that backlash?
Well, you know, I think the point that Don Glendon is making is that whenever there are signs of Black achievement, there is always an attempt to repel it or suppress it or even destroy it. So I'm thinking in particular of the mention of the Hayti district in Durham and the running of the highway through the Black business district. That's one example. I think the more violent examples include the destruction of so-called Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, the massacre that took place in Wilmington in 1898. So that where there were signs of Black prosperity or Black success, there was a violent backlash. But I think that to the extent that you can make changes in communities with widespread political support across all groups in the community, you might mitigate some of the magnitude of that backlash. But it is something to be aware of because it's always a possibility. But it strikes me that you're not going to change what's happening in Chapel Hill schools unless you can change who's on the school board, which would require changing who is voting for the members of the school board and what their attitudes and outlook is. And I'm hopeful, you know, to some degree that a film like this one will alert people to the types of positions and behaviors that they've engaged in the past that have maintained the type of school system that exists today. A school system that's expresses this notion that it's a high quality, high achieving school system when it has a significant portion of its student body that is underachieving.
And so, yeah, and what people are talking about, Carol Anderson calls white rage, right? That anytime there's any kind of Black progress of any kind, there's white backlash or white rage. And I think, so, you know, I can think about this, and again, my work is on smaller scale, like in individual schools rather than larger policy, but we see that same thing happening in schools in Chapel Hill. So for example, school where I worked, where parents called in and complained about, because the school had two administrators of color, two Black administrators, that the school was only representing the interests of the Black kids at the school. And they didn't say the Black kids at the school, they said kids in the walk zone. So they used a spatial term. They used a term to talk about the neighborhood where kids lived to indicate race, to try to excuse themselves of a race. But basically, both those parents who were making that complaint and some of the white teachers who supported them were seeing Black people in leadership positions, Black people sometimes expressing joy with other people, and the response was white rage, and is, in other words, the need to try to control that and keep it in check. And so what can we do? We can be versed in what that looks like. And I think to Dr. Darity's point, so we have people on the school board and we have administrators at Lincoln Center. They have to really, really support those administrators and teachers when they face white rage. Like, they have to step in and be the brave people that are going to speak against the white folks who are going to come in and try to control Black progress and Black success and Black genius.
I think that narrative is very important. And I think making that narrative clear And, we only recently learned really about, it's not commonplace to learn about Black Wall Street, and certainly not the repercussions of Black progress. So I think narrative is very important to place that in the school system, to really talk about that freely, I think is really important. And I so think that it's important to talk with our children about what the real situation is. I think we live on a social justice continuum. It didn't start in 2020, and it probably will not be completed in our lifetime. And I think our children need to be aware of that. Our children feel what it feels like to be talked down to or to be treated differently. Sometimes they can't articulate it, but they know what it is. And so my goal is always to be, of course, age appropriate, but to talk about these real issues and talk about this backlash that potentially comes from tapping into that Black genius. And then talking with my children about where they sit on the continuum of social justice, that this is a fight that we always have to continue to fight. It's not fair that we have to fight it, but we're in it. And what does that look like? What are the potential pushbacks from engaging in this work? And I just think that we need to be real honest. I think we need to be more honest with each other. I think we need to be more honest and explicit in the school system. And I think we need to tell our children the truth about what's going on. And I think that's the best way to prepare them for the potential backlash, is not to sugarcoat it. Because Chapel Hill is very versed in sugar-coated racism and sugar-coated oppression. And I think we just need to take the sugar off it and say what it is.
And start even before they make it to the Chapel Hill school system. Start with the youngest. Ibram Kendi came out with the book Anti-Racist Baby that gives us words to use, gives us a framework to be able to speak with even our youngest children about this. So yes, what you're saying is so important and so powerful. If we can have these conversations early, then not only are we speaking about it, but we're teaching children how to speak about this also.
Great, thank you all so much. And so we also have some of our other participants in the film here. So I know Sonia Brown and Denise Page are here, and they have a couple of things that they would like to add to the conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and give them a minute and see if we can allow them the ability to chime in as well. Both Sonia and Denise are parents in the school system. They were featured in the film, as I just mentioned. Both of them are historically rooted in this community, and both of them, if I'm not mistaken, have gone through the school system themselves. So Sonia and Denise, if you're able to. Hello, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi. You have a question you want me to answer?
All right, see, Denise, you can go ahead and ask your question. Thank you so much for joining us.
I don't necessarily have a question.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for coming in. Thank you so much also for working with us throughout the process of this film. Sonia, do you have a question or anything that you would like to add?
No, I was going to say, when Vitalia was talking about how the teachers make the student feel intimidated, my daughter had some issues in 5th grade and also in young kindergarten, dealing with teachers pushing their concerns, like I said, to the backside. They felt like she felt like she wasn't important. There was no point of even expressing her concerns to the teacher, as a white teacher, or even if it was a Black teacher. It still felt like it was not even important to express their concerns or their difficulty understanding the materials that's being taught. So even if I would tell her to advocate and the teacher know what's going on, she felt like there was no point to even do it. So she was already defeated, and she's not progressing as she should, as the other kids in the classroom are. So each year she get pushed back further and further and further. So she's not even where she's supposed to be right now in 8th grade. She's behind and struggling. And every time I have a meeting with the teacher or whoever is IP, whatever I think she needs, was already downplayed it. You know, she's okay, she'll get it, it's all right. And for me, I already know because I went to Chapel, you know, I was graduating in 97, and the gap and the struggle for us was there, and it's still there. So it's upsetting for my daughter, who doesn't really feel that she needs to advocate or even do to our highest potential in the classroom.
And I want to go ahead and as we start to come to the beginning of the end of this conversation, I kind of wanted to point to a question that was asked by Ms. Wanda Hunter. Thank you so much for your contribution. She really does kind of lay out the hierarchy that exists within these school systems, right? So teachers are accountable to principals, principals are accountable to upper level administration, then the superintendent, the school board. All of these things are kind of happening. The community has input, white, highly educated parents have input in the school system, but how can we demand accountability from our leaders for the disastrous outcomes that are producing? And as we think about demanding accountability from our leaders, a couple people have also asked about what are the next steps. So is demanding accountability one of the next steps? Ms. Mason-Hogans, I know that you mentioned really publicizing that there is a gap, right? And not letting up until it is addressed. That could be another next step. What are some of the tangible things that people can start to do right away if they, after listening to this conversation, really do want to be on the front lines in pushing this change? We began this conversation saying that nothing has really changed in 50 years. There's been plenty of initiatives to kind of spark this change, but none of them have really taken, right? None of them have really caused a good enough change. None of them have lasted. So how do we do that, and how can we start that today? And I know Ms. Wanda Hunter, if you have anything to add to your comments, hopefully I did them justice, then by all means go ahead and do that as well.
Well, I would like to put my movement hat on for a minute and say that I don't see any reason that we should look at people on the school board as some sort of authorities on education that we can't possess. So I'm a very big believer in taking someone that we trust from the community and running them for particular positions. I don't have any problems with that. Dr. Ben talked about, and she's probably gonna get upset with me for saying this, but I think Coretta Sharpless should be on the school board. I think people who have a history for advocating for our children should be on the school board. I think they should come from the community. I think the community should be answerable to them. I think it shouldn't just be one person, but it should be a community that advocates for that, instead of looking for help from folks that we don't know who come into the communities. We don't know what their agenda is. We know what their stated agenda is, but I can tell you that I think it's a better idea to elect people from the community who represent and reflect our values. And I don't think we should be afraid to do that. And I don't think that we should look for other people to come in and save us when we have the genius, the ability, the creativity, and the dedication within our communities. I think, for the record, I will say that I think we have a really good progressive school board, and I appreciate a lot of the people on the school board, but I really think it's part of this pathology where we feel that somebody has to come in and save us, when I think the best answers are going to come from the people who are experiencing this oppression and will come from the community. Sorry, Coretta, if she's on.
I think the biggest piece is missing is parents. Don't want to ask the parents anything. Like, parents need to have a say so. Parents know what our kids experience. Our kids leave out whole from the house for them to go to a school for authority to tear them down. Then they come home and parents have to rebuild them to go back out into the schools the next day for them to be torn down again. And no one has the ask the parents anything about what the child needs. They want their signature on everything. They want them to okay everything. It's okay for us to treat your child this way in the school. It's okay for us to do this, but your child must abide by whatever rule I put forth, and you must abide by that rule. But I'm grown and you're grown, but my child, I don't have no say so from over my kid. That's not how it works. So you can't make a decision for my kid without talking to me. So why not have a conversation with me instead of talking at me? Come see me and let's have a conversation, because we're adults in this matter. And my children are affected by this, not your children, because you know how to get your kids through the system because you make the policy.
Thank you so much. And so I really do kind of want to give our attendees some things to kind of pick up and leave with. And we really have started to talk about some of the really tangible next steps that we can take. So before we end, I just kind of want to ask all of our panelists, is there anything else that you want to add, right? One of the things that we really were hoping to accomplish with this documentary and with hosting these panels is how can we get to a point where we are making lasting change? How can we get to a point where we are talking about the right things and shifting a conversation so that we're not sugarcoating it, but that we are really calling out power and really calling out these issues. So on that note, is there anything else that you all would like to add before we wrap up?
The only thing I want to say is for parents, when they come in for concerns for the kids and being told that this is going to be done, like my daughter had a problem with handwriting, they write complete sentences, and told that, well, we're going to get on and this is going to happen. And like I said, now she's in 8th grade. I've been asking this and it's not being done, knowing that she has to have this regardless. Actually, not just telling me you're going to do it, but actually doing something to make her improve in that area would make me feel so much better to know that my daughter's at somewhere that really concerned about her education. Because right now I don't see it. Even for her 504, I've been concerned about things. I went to the school. I've had meetings. I went to the Lincoln Center. I do the steps you're supposed to take. And I'm not getting heard. But like Denise was saying, you have to follow their policy. You have to go to the steps of principal, teacher, whatever the steps is, you have to follow. But when a parent comes with concerns, you pick and choose what part of the complaint you address. And that's frustrating.
I think frequently the claim is made that parents are not involved adequately. And I think that both Ms. Brown and Ms. Page's comments indicate that that's not at all the case, that that's not the problem. They're deeply involved, but their concerns are ignored. And so I think we have to pay close attention to that.
So you asked before, what does white supremacy look like in schools? That's what white supremacy looks like in school, right? And so what do we, I wish I was a better big policy, big picture. What do we do to change school systems? That's not my strength, but I know that, and Dr. Darity talked about this as well, there are places doing it differently, right? And there are places, and we can imagine school so much different from how we imagine it now, right? Or what we think about as schooling is so limited. So what if, what if we started to think about school, I'm paraphrasing someone else's words, but like that, where it was impossible for a student to fail. It was impossible for a student to fail. And so if you set up the conditions to make that impossible, that this is a radically different way to look at what was schools. Our schools are built to sort and segregate, and they do it often very, very well, right? And the documentary talks about this, people on this panel have talked about this. So if that's their purpose, we can't just take out the purpose of the school and make some little changes here and there. We have to take a lot of things down, right? We have to take a lot of, I would say probably most of what we do in schools, we have to take down. And then we have to start thinking, we have to imagine a much more I don't know, I mean, first of all, a much more fun school system than we have, but a much more like complete school system that dealt with people beyond building up with a certain set of skills.
Thank you so much.
I would add on to that. Maybe we can learn something from early childhood. Look at Head Start. They have a policy council with parent voice. Decisions have to be approved by parents. You can't hire people without the policy council knowing who they are. Maybe that's one thing that can bring some change before we can get to the radical change that Dr. Blaisdell was just talking about. That would be amazing, because we know if you have high expectations for someone, they're going to live up to it. So let's have those high expectations.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kale. And so on that note, I really do want to wrap up. Thank you all so much for attending. I want to give a huge thank you to all of our attendees, all of our panelists, all of our cast members who were so willing to jump in to this discussion. Thank you so much. Ms. Mason-Hogans, Dr. Darity, Dr. Blaisdell, Ms. Kale, thank you all so much for taking part in this conversation. And thank you for speaking so clearly to all of these issues and really teasing out what it is that we can do next. Thank you to our audience and our attendees. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for viewing our film. Thank you for sharing it in your own circles. We really do appreciate all of your help and support. Thanks to our production team. Really, this documentary would not have come about with the production team, but it also would not have come about without the donations and the contributions from the community, grants from the Oak Foundation, grants from the Fenwick Foundation, but then also all of our community partnerships. So the NAACP Youth Council, thank you all for taking part in this viewing and sponsoring this. We all appreciate your contributions to this project. I have posted another link to the program in the chat. There you can read more about all of our panelists and our cast members. There's also a link to our website, imsmart2.org. As a production team, we really did want to continue to provide these resources and access to these resources to the community. So if you go there, you'll see all of the things that we dived into when we were in Wilson Library, all of our sources, our timeline, if you really do want to learn more about this project as we host more screenings, learning more about that. So thank you all so much again for coming. And with that, I bid you all a good night.